It's a great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Richard Gipps. For anybody who's organising a series of lectures on the philosophy of mental health and mental illness, which this is, Richard is a kind of dream invitee. Richard is a chartered clinical psychologist. He's also an associate member of the Faculty of Philosophy in Oxford. He's a co-editor of at least 2 volumes, the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry, and just to show a little bit of breadth, the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychoanalysis. And his recent book on madness, Understanding the Psychotic Mind, available in all good bookshops, came out with Bloomsbury in 2022. His talk this evening is called Who Gets to Call Whom Mad and With What Right? Richard.
Thanks so much, Edward. Yeah, so that's the question. Who gets to call whom mad? But I mean, that question could mean quite a lot of things, right? So, I mean, you might use it to try and combat stigma surrounding the word mad. You know, who are you to say, you throw this word around at me? Maybe we shouldn't be using such words. Or we might use it to frame a question about the adequacy of training of mental health clinicians. You know, who is it that gets to take up that, position? There might be some kind of allied questions about what these days gets called epistemic injustice. I mean, what I mean by that here is we would certainly do somebody wrong if, having decided that they warrant a psychiatric diagnosis of some kind of psychosis of some sort, that thereby we didn't listen to their opinions about anything, right? So that we kind of didn't realize that, as it were, they were but mad north by northwest, but thought they were mad to core, and so we shouldn't kind of listen to them about anything. Right, those aren't my questions tonight. I'm sure they may be more important questions than the ones I'm about to ask, but this is a philosophical lecture, right? So I'm going to pursue a philosophical theme. Whose thought world will be the one judged aberrant? On what basis? With what right? Who is attached and who is detached from reality? Or whose reality is the sane one? The poet Nathaniel Lee, a 17th century poet and bon viveur and generally kind of syphilitic kind of mad person, if you like, he said, as he was being carted off to the Bedlam Hospital, he shouted out, "They called me mad, and I called them mad, and damn them, they outvoted me." Right? So that's the kind of spirit of it's who gets to say who shall count as mad? That's the spirit of the question. Who gets to say, right? In any particular case, we might say, well, we say that Jones is mad because he truly believes that aliens are after him and that he's a secret agent or something. And okay, good, right. That's a good answer. If someone says, well, why'd you say Jones is mad? And you say, well, he seems to think that right, that's kind of mad to think that, right? But imagine we then ask, well, but what is it about believing aliens are after you that makes you count as mad? But I should just say, I use the word mad quite happily. You might also use delusional or psychotic. I'm just going to use the word mad today in the talk. Okay. So asking that question, in virtue of what is believing that aliens are after you an instance of delusion? It's not simply the falsity of the belief, right? So many of us, all of us here, will have thousands of false beliefs, I imagine, but we're not on that account to be counted mad. And nor, I think, can we get to delusion by adding further adjectives like, as well as false, like unusual or recalcitrant. I mean, somebody maybe very stubbornly maintain their delusional belief. And it may be very unusual, maybe statistically atypical in a certain culture, unusual in that sense, right? But you don't get to delusion that way. There's plenty of non-delusional eccentrics and enthusiasts around who have got their hobby horses and which are and which they espouse beliefs which are often false and can be very hard to argue them out of that. Doesn't mean that they're psychotic on that basis, right? So there can be that tempting thought, and psychiatric manuals sometimes take that way with the question, that you could try and, as it were, add to falsity, get to delusion by adding further qualities to belief like falsity, like the stubbornly maintained, like the statistically non-prevalent within the local community. It's a bit like for those of you who've had some philosophical training, and perhaps some of you will have done, given the talk, the hosts of the talk. It's a bit like in epistemology when Gettier put the lie to those people who thought that you could get to knowledge by adding properties to belief. You know, so you have belief, okay, but it's not, you don't know something just because you believe it. Oh, well, it's true belief, or it's justified true belief, and so on. And then the chap Gettier comes along and shows how that's not going to get you where you want to go. So similarly, in the opposite direction, you know, you can question, I think, whether or not you can get to delusion by kind of adding further qualities like falsity and recalcitrance and atypicality. I mean, there's a right answer to this question, and I'm just going to say it. I mean, I believe it's the right answer. Delusion involves a loss of reality testing. And that doesn't mean the delusional person is simply someone who stops, as it were, comparing his belief against reality and testing. It's not some failure of, as it were, hypothesis testing, right? It means something more like an inward collapse of imagination and judgment into one another, one that denatures both, so that you can no longer answer the question properly as to whether or not this person, this delusional person right now in their delusion, is either making a reality-oriented judgment or is engaging in an active imagining. And we might get to that later, but I mean, that's, you know, that's not the tack I'm going to pursue for now. But the thing is, and the reason for that is because if you're so minded as to ask, but who gets to say questions? Who gets to say who's mad? Nathaniel Lee, right? What makes you guys, you know, the ones who can say that I'm mad? I think you're mad, right? If you're minded to say that, who gets to say, to ask that, you're going to repeat that kind of question for the lost reality testing answer too. Whose judgment about that shall stand? So maybe it's what gets called common consent then. So they called me mad. That's what he said as he was being carted off to Bedlam, right? Who's the they? Well, it's the other ones, you know, the crowd, the generality, right? So for the philosophers here, this might remind you a bit of Kripke's, Wittgenstein's communitarian answer to what underwrites the meaningfulness of our words. Or we might call it, I'm going to call it this, you don't need to understand why I'm calling it this, but I'm going to call this position idealism, following the idea of what you might call a Kantian Copernican revolution in psychiatry. So one little bit of Kant, don't need to get into the philosophy of this, I just want to, for those who are interested, I want to show you why I'm calling it this position idealism. Kant suggested that it's not really that something should be counted a viable representation if it conforms to the nature of the objects it represents. Rather, in his Copernican revolution that turned things around, something is to be counted an object if it conforms to the standard set by our representations. That's a general kind of shift that he introduced in his idealist philosophy. So here the thought is, it's not that judgments of madness are appropriate if they conform to some feature of their object, namely something about the mad person. It's rather that if that object doesn't conform to some feature of the judgments of those who count themselves sane, namely the commonality of those people, that's in the virtue, that's the basis on which we shall say that the person is mad. Right. This idealist option is something you find in R.D. Laing's book, The Divided Self. So R.D. Laing was a famous, perhaps infamous, 1960s Scottish psychiatrist. He wrote a great book called The Divided Self, which I recommend to you all. Here's a longish quote from him. He said, "When two sane people meet, there's a mutual and reciprocal recognition of each other's identity. However, if there are discrepancies of a sufficiently radical kind remaining after attempts to align them have failed, there's no alternative but that one of us must be insane. I have no difficulty in regarding another person as psychotic if, for instance, he says he's Napoleon, whereas I say he is not, or if he says I am Napoleon, whereas I say I am not." Right? Notice Laing puts the I say, he doesn't just say, if he says he's Napoleon, but he's not. It's like, but if I say he's not. Right? So to carry on with the quote, "I suggest, therefore, that sanity or psychosis is tested by the degree of conjunction or disjunction between two persons where the one is sane by common consent. The psychotic, he says, is the name we have for the other person in a disjunctive relationship of a particular kind. There's different ways of reading this passage of Lang. I'm going to start, though, by taking it in a kind of non-ironic register and ask, can we really be happy with this kind of answer? Right? It's just a numbers game. It's just that you outvoted me. It's because you're all carrying on in your way, and I wasn't carrying on in the way that you're carrying on, that you get to call me mad, right? Can that really be okay? I mean, first of all, doesn't it seem worryingly subjective? I mean, if you can't understand me, maybe that's your problem, right? Why should it be my problem? And a rather radical critique might go something like this. What if it's actually you? What if actually you, who I call mad, are, I don't know, an enlightened sage? And I'm a boring normie, right, whose doors of perception haven't been opened, right? You're a kind of red-pilled philosopher or a sage or a madman who's escaped the matrix, and I'm a blue-pilled, boring psychiatrist trying to keep everyone within it, right, refusing to see other ways of thinking. Okay. Now, I'm putting it in a kind of whimsical way, right? But I think we can feel the kind of, at least some aspect of the force of that kind of critique. I wouldn't want to condone, I wouldn't want to go along with it, right? But if you're not alive to having to deal with that thought, then something's gone wrong. Here's a rather different, more prosaic concern. This idea that you get to call me mad simply because you all think one way and I just don't think the same way as you, it's open to political abuse. It's something that one found in the USSR, the idea that people who had some different political ideas were suffering from reformist delusions and needed to go to psychiatric hospital. I might also ask, who shall be this we? What size of community is required? What size of supposedly self-appointed guardians of sanity, right, is required in order to count somebody out with that, so that their way of thinking, their way of going on doesn't match the size of the community. I mean, the whole world, right? Or some little small group of people? What if it's just one person? What if I'm the mad person says, well, in my community of one, I'm 100% in a concordance with, myself, and so it's all, this is a perfectly sane world here, thank you very much. So those are some worries about what I've called the idealist option, right? The idea that you get to call someone mad simply if they don't toe the line in certain ways of thought. Right, we might instead think, though, that it's not a conceptual truth, but instead an empirical truth that thankfully madness isn't that common. Right? Rather than it being a necessary truth that madness is necessarily a minority pursuit, as it were, I might instead just think, well, thankfully it's just a fact of nature. It's just a fact of human life. But thankfully, most people aren't insane, but that doesn't tell us anything. Those different numbers, as it were, don't tell us anything important about what it is to be mad. So that was an idealist suggestion. Here's something I'm going to call a realist suggestion. Right, so not the Copernican revolution, but also not simply, well, you are mad, or you're mad because you think that, the aliens are after you, end of, right? You want to be able to try and say more than that. And so what you hope is that something in or about you, there's something in or about you, reference to which warrants the application of a psychiatric lens. Some natural fact about you, perhaps. Perhaps there's some neurological or cognitive mechanism. Something we can all agree on as recognizing something that we can all, perhaps there's some mechanism that's gone wrong, right? So some neurological mechanism, some psychological mechanism, cognitive mechanism, call it what you will. And although the diagnosis of delusion or psychosis might be contentious, maybe everybody could simply agree as a matter of fact that this mechanism has up the creek, right? And on that basis, we can then say, oh yeah, look, if that mechanism's up the creek, then that warrants my judgment that, this person is delusional. But there aren't any such universal mechanisms that we know of. And cognitive scientists will sometimes talk of things like, I don't know, mechanisms of belief formation. But I mean, what are those? I mean, beliefs aren't like little sausages or something that pop out the end of some mechanism, right? And if there were a reliable biomarker, appealing to its presence could only evidence the reliability of a particular diagnosis of psychosis in a particular person and wouldn't address the deeper question of what vouchsafes anyone's right to ever diagnose anyone, or why we should see this as a biomarker of psychosis, of madness, right? And that's because you just do need an independently derived idea of what makes for madness to even tally with the biomarker. We don't care what biological states people are in, fundamentally. We care whether or not they are suffering a psychosis. Okay, in short, neurological, psychological disturbances are causes and not criteria for psychosis, and so they can't warrant such diagnosis more generally. I'll just say one more thing about this, what I call this realist option. Why shouldn't psychiatric judgment, the judgment of insanity, of delusion, just stand on its own terms? Why must its warrant be given over to some other discipline, neuroscience or psychology? So what more general warrant could there be? What warrant could there be for the exclusion of some people, the mad, from the domain of reason? Here's a little extract from a book called Mad Knowledges and User-Led Research by Diana Rose. She writes this: "It is psychiatry that has constituted madness as a mental illness." I mean, okay, actually, yeah, psychiatrists or alienists before them did that. I mean, they took our notion of madness and, if you like, used the language of medicine, illness, and so on to articulate it, conceptualize it as an illness of a sort. And its practice renders the mad person the antithesis of reason. I mean, that's a bit peculiar, it seems to me. We might have thought that somebody is to be counted the antithesis of reason simply in virtue of being mad rather than being virtue of being mentally ill, right? That concept of the irrationality was already available to people before they had the idea of mental illness. But then she says, and it's on that basis, the practice of psychiatry, of describing people who suffer madness as being mentally ill, it's on that basis that the speech of the mad person is cut off. This is the idea of epistemic injustice. He's just mad. Okay. Now, there's problems with this idea, I think. But anyway, the important thought is, what really should stop the mad person from just returning the dubious compliment and, say, constituting psychiatric thought as unreason? Or better yet, might we not just refuse to play this game of people calling other people mad? This option I'm calling relativism, right? We had idealism, we had realism, and now I'm suggesting a third label, relativism. You're in your world, I'm in my world. Your world's got its own, I don't know, forms of reason, its own logic, if you like. It's different knowledges that you have, or something like this, right? And I've got mine, right? But I'm committing some terrible act of, I don't know, kind of psychological colonialism if I come in and say, well, you're not living up to the standards of rationality that I'm kind of going to, trot out, right? And you might do the same to me, but no, can't we just live and let live? This is the relativistic option, right? We're all in our own worlds, carrying on in our own ways, and this whole game of kind of some people calling other people mad is something we want to just, right, let go of. This is going to be the main kind of object of my critique, this kind of relativistic position today. Okay. Look back to the Lang quote I gave earlier. The psychotic, he says, is the name we have for the other person in a disjunctive relationship of a particular kind. Right, disjunctive meaning that person can't be made sense of by others, right? Vice versa. Read that idea ironically, and we have the idea that the self-proclaimed rational psychiatrist could equally be called psychotic. It's just a matter of a disjunction. The idea here is of madness as unreason rather than of different reason. The idea that madness is unreason as opposed to just different reason is the one to be challenged. I'd like to introduce you to a character now, and he's called the psychologician. The psychologician is the philosopher or psychiatrist or psychologist who buys into this idea of relativism, right? Buys into the idea that Madness is just something that some people call other people when they can't understand them and so on. But really, we're all just living in our own worlds with our own ways of reasoning. And they're all ways of reasoning, right? That's the idea. So, the anti-psychologistic German logician Gottlob Frege in the 1890s, he describes a character called the psychological logician or the psychologician. And this person construes logical laws of right reasoning, right, as descriptions of how we happen to think. So that if, as a contingent matter of fact, we, that is you and I, had thought differently, then we would just have different laws. And it's when he's presenting an implication of the thought of the psychological logician Benno Erdmann, Frege asks this. He says, what if beings were even found whose laws of thought directly contradicted ours, so that their application often led to opposite results? The psychological logician could only accept this and say, for them, those laws hold, and for us, these. Whereas I, Frege that is, would say, here we have a hitherto unknown kind of madness. I'll give you another. So that was Benno Erdmann as a psychologician, and Frege's drawing out implications of his thought. And here's another person. There's a psychiatrist called Ayad von Domerus, who in the 1940s suggested that the schizophrenic subject was someone who follows alternative paralogical laws of thought, whereas the sane logician accepts identity. I'll come on to what I mean by identity in a second. Whereas the sane logician accepts identity only upon the basis of identical subjects, the schizophrenic paralogician accepts identity based upon identical predicates. Right? Give an example, it should become clear what he means, right? Thus, a schizophrenic patient of the insane asylum of the university in Bonn identified a saint with a cigar box and with the male sex. By identified, he says they're the same thing, right? So that's pretty strange, right? Thinks that a saint and a cigar box and the male sex are all somehow the same. And he did so, according to von Domerus, because of what he could predicate of each one of these different subjects. And because this predicate was the same for the three subjects, they were held to be identical. I think it was something like they're all encircled. So the saint has got a halo, like so. The cigar box has got a band around it. And the thing about the male sex, it was something like the male sex is as a collective encircled by the snare of the kind of lure of the female, or something like this. But that was the kind of idea, right? There's some similar property under some description of being encircled. That was the basis in this paralogician, this schizophrenic logician's kind of world, for a claim about the identity of these subjects. Okay. Now, if we follow the psychologician, here comes the idea, perhaps we can now, after all, do what the Warwick philosopher Naomi Island said in a lovely phrase, which was solve simultaneously for understanding and utter strangeness, right? So we've got this situation. On the one hand, we've got somebody who's carrying on very differently from us, and we can't make any sense of them, so they seem utterly strange. But on the other hand, they're a human being. We want to try and understand them the best we can. And the psychologician's thought, the relativist's thought, is that, well, maybe we can in a way do this. We can say that they just live in their world with its own laws of reason. They're still laws of reason. You've got yours, I've got mine, live and let live. They are, in a way, utterly strange to us. But we might say not to them, right? Because they're reasoning in the way that they understand reason to be. And for sure, it is the case that the delusional, or for that matter, the delirious or the dreaming subject often isn't puzzled by their own thought. But the question is still alive, I think, is whether or not their thought really is intelligible even to them. Does adding a to them or a to us to it being intelligible really get us anywhere? It's the kind of question I want to ask in what follows. Here's my general first point. If we only consider this relativistic thought of different thought worlds in kind of utterly general terms, the way I've just put it, like You live in your world of laws of reason. I live in my world of my own laws of reason. There's a disjunction between them. When that happens, perhaps when one of the people's in the minority, then they get called mad, but come on guys, live and let live, right? If we only consider that in rather general terms and don't stop to consider it carefully, or maybe it looks intelligible. Right? Maybe it looks intelligible that the person who's psychotic has got their own way of thinking, if you like. It's still a way of thinking, it's a way of reasoning, still rationally intelligible. It's just different, okay? That's the thought. Maybe it looks intelligible if we just say it in the glib way I just said it, right? But I put it to you that if we actually stop and do some philosophy, rather than merely indulge a kind of metaphysical whimsy and look into it carefully, we might find something rather different. So I'm going to do a little bit of philosophy now, right? So take von Domerus's idea. And by the way, because philosophy is partly about coming up with, seemingly helpful ideas or fancy ideas and things, and it's partly about trying to be accountable and responsible in how we think. And you've got to do both of those together, right? So take von Domerus's idea that the logician accepts identity only upon the basis of identical subjects, whereas the schizophrenic paralogician accepts identity based upon identical predicates, right? The same encircled thing going on with the cigar box, was it, and the saint and the male sex were all the same because they've got this identical thing can be predicated of them, namely they're all encircled in some way. Right? Now, here's the question. Are these two, the logician, with his idea that, a cigar box and the saint are just different subjects, and so they can't be identical, right? Different things, they can't be identical. And the paralogician, with his idea that no, it's having identical properties means that you can count as identical in this kind of game, in this thought world, right? Are they really working with fundamentally different understandings of identity, as von Domerus suggests? Well, how do we assess that? First of all, we could ask, are they just using the word identical differently? It's possible. You might meet someone who just kind of accidentally wandered off the common usage path with the notion of identity, right, and kind of talks differently now. But if that was the case, perhaps we've solved rather too well for strangeness. People were just talking past each other. It'd be rather like scientists who seem to be at loggerheads regarding the meaning of their data, but then they realize they've just used different units, or that one meant median by average, whilst the other one meant mean. But now, if we take that approach and suggest that people are just using, had a different concept of identity, used the word identity differently, now we've effectively collapsed the schizophrenic paralogician, right, back into our own logical scheme. We failed to make room for strangeness, right? We're just using a different word, that's fine. And we might think, well, why can't they just use the normal word? Why can't they just speak normally? How difficult can it be to use a word differently? They just join the gang and we're all kind of thinking the same after all, basically, right? Just using a word differently. We might wonder, though, what stops someone linguistically conforming if that's really what's going on? Or perhaps, though, we might think, well, no, maybe in some sense they do mean something the same by the word identical. So when the paralogician says that cigar boxes and saints and the male sex are all identical, is that the paralogician, after all, was said to have a different logic of identity. They mean in some sense, supposedly, the same by it, that is, identity, which is always to do with subjects, actually, identity of subjects. It's just that living in different logical universes, they somehow have different versions of what in some obscure sense is yet still the same thing. Perhaps it's like having different number systems, base 2 or 12 and not 10. They're all still numbers regardless of what base you're kind of counting in, right, using. But what are we saying, right? If you're having trouble following I hope you're having trouble following what I'm saying, because I'm talking nonsense, right? I mean, that's what you do when you do philosophy. You kind of get moved to say certain things, but they are kind of nonsensical. You exceed the intelligibility of what you're saying, and then you have to kind of reel it back in and say, hang on a minute, what am I saying? Consider this. How shall we tell if someone means the same by identity? We do so, as I've just been doing here, by trying to see what sense someone's making, right, with their words. We try and make sense of these words. But the radical claim on this psychologician's table is not, remember, that people are just using different words, but they live in different thought worlds of different laws of thought. So if we try to make sense of this person, the so-called schizophrenic paralogician, right, we'll just end up bringing them into our world. Because we can't, after all, step outside of our world, right? So then we lose the idea of different worlds of meaning. But if we keep the idea of ourselves being stuck in our very own logical worlds, what now warrants our claim that they're speaking with their own meanings, with their own reasons, rather than just talking nonsense? And worse, like, within which logical scheme shall we even formulate our metaphysical speculations about different logical worlds? Within our own scheme? But then we shan't understand what we're saying when we talk about other such schemes, right? Because these logical schemes, logic is like the rules for thought itself, right? There's no outside of these when we're talking about having intelligible ideas. But instead within another scheme. But our notion of identity is our notion. And unlike one or another number base, which particular base isn't constitutive of the very idea of number, identity is constitutive of cogent thought itself. Hence Frege, who I was quoting earlier, he says that whereas other persons presume to acknowledge and doubt a law in the same breath, it seems to me an attempt to jump out of one's own skin, against which I can do no more than urgently warn them. Okay, so the psychologician, he presented himself, or the relativist, right, the relativistic psychologician, he presented himself as humbly making room for difference. Right? This is the fundamental driving idea of it, is to not exclude, not to damn, not to judge. So you've got your way of reasoning, I've got mine. Okay, live and let live. Don't be some oppressive colonialist kind of whatever of the mind, you know, right? There's fundamentally different ways of going on, fundamentally different, let's call them rationalities, right? Different, and sane ones and mad ones, or whatever label you might like. But we shouldn't judge as awry such thought as merely fails to conform to the model of our own parochial way of going on. That's the thought. Sounds like a nice thought, sounds like a friendly thought. But when we think about it more clearly, we see that it's really the psychologician with his overreaching notion of alternative laws of logic, who is hubristically and actually without any humility offering us an only seemingly intelligible notion. Furthermore, this idea of making sense to oneself is not to others. That's a kind of an idea which is rather antithetical to humility itself, in that it refuses the fundamental requirement of thought to be accountable, which is always necessarily to others when meaning-making is going on. I mean, that, by the way, is narcissism, right? That refusal of accountability. Okay. So something which looked very friendly actually turns out, as I see it, to be rather narcissistic. So much then for idealism, realism, relativism. But what then? How shall we answer the what gives someone the right to call someone else mad question? I'll just make two quick asides before I go on to say what I want to say about it. First of all, I mean, this is another thing one's got to do when doing philosophy. Sometimes we talk nonsense, but there was something good in it, right? Something that can easily get covered, easily get wrongly discarded if we just kind of charge ahead and kind of just focus on what's wrong with the thought. So von Domerus and his confused idea that the cigar box and the saint and whatever are all to be judged, but the paralogician thinks that they're the same in virtue of them having the similar property, right? So von Domerus, his idea that there is this kind of confusion, or this kind of seeming kind of notion of identity going on in the mind of the person who's suffering from delusion, or in thought disorder, informal thought disorder in this case, actually. What he's noticing is something quite important, I think, about the nature of formal thought disorder, or the nature of the dream. Freud called it primary process, the primary process of condensation. You've probably all had this. You have a dream, and in the dream, there you were, you were back at, I don't know, like the swimming pool of your primary school, but also somehow it was the swimming pool of that holiday you went on last year in Cyprus, and there was your brother there, but somehow at the same time he was also the head teacher of that secondary school you were at. And these figures kind of fuse, and if you stop and think about it, and well, what was it about them that made them kind of fuse? It's often got something to do with, well, you notice that, well, they're both swimming pools, right? And your brother in that primary school, whatever I said, teacher, they've both got kind of, red hair and beards or something, right? So that's the way that dreams often work, associatively. And when you're telling them, you say, you start saying things, I was stroking my cat. Well, no, it wasn't my cat. It was actually the cat from, oh, well, that doesn't really make sense. And that is the nature of dream thought. The point is, though, it's not a way of making sense. It's not a different way of making sense. It's a way of not making sense, but it's got that phenomenological quality, right? That it's kind of collapsed, different subjects collapse into each other in that way. We can't retrieve rationality from it, though, by noticing that, as von Domerus hoped. Okay, the second little hiatus. We do well, I think, to try and do justice to what I'll call not just to phenomenology, but to motivational psychology. That is to say, we might perfectly well understand psychologically why someone needs to form a belief that, as it happens, makes no sense. It's not rationally intelligible that the recently divorced part-time hospital porter in a Parisian hospital could think himself the King of France. You might say, you'd have to be mad to think that, which doesn't mean to say that if you did become mad, then it would become a rationally available thought, right? It might not be rationally intelligible that he could think that, given what else he thinks and knows. But nevertheless, it's psychologically intelligible to us why he might need to. We can understand the motivation to form the belief, to escape from the intolerable wretchedness of his life, even if we can't see any rationality to the belief in question, right? You can be motivated to believe something that makes no sense. It does some work for you, having that belief. Psychological work, not rational work. Okay. Now again, rather than simply answer the who gets to say question, who gets to say, who gets to call who mad, let's step sideways for a minute and do what I hinted at earlier and try and recover the sui generic nature of psychiatric judgment. We started with, what is it about believing aliens are after you that makes you count as mad or as having lost reality testing? No rule, which by its very nature offers psychiatric judgment with extra psychiatric grounds, can tell us. That was my critique of realism, if you remember. The proper thing to do is either to answer that who gets to say question by just spelling it out psychiatrically. This person has lost her mind. Or to refuse the with what right or with what basis question altogether. Just say, well, you get your eye in as to what counts as delusional. You learn to play this particular language game. You learn to make certain distinctive psychiatric kind of judgment. You use your discernment phronesis, to use the fancy philosophical word. Who gets to say who is mad? Well, here's another tack on the question. Who gets to say this is a pen, right? It's not that this is a hall, or that I'm the speaker, or that this is a microphone. I mean, no particular person gets to say that this is a pen, right? I mean, language itself, if you like, gets to say this is a pen, and anyone who knows how to speak language gets to use it. And language is something to which we must make ourselves accountable. Being acquainted with psychotic conditions, as clinicians are, and many other people are, that helps. But even here, you don't need from the clinician something as specialized as, I don't know, who gets to say who has pneumonia, right? That's something which a medic in particular might need, might be called on to judge. But the judgment of insanity is something which many people can do. The psychiatric task is to take real responsibility in making judgments that are often fearsome in this way, proclaiming somebody mad, potentially then, not necessarily, but potentially depriving them of their liberties even. It might be tempting in that situation to try and hide your responsibility and your accountability behind criteria or checklists. Realism, in effect, as I used the term earlier, it kind of accountability shifts, if you like. I'm using the word a bit like blame shifting, right? For the realist, it's the psychologist or the neurologist is the one whose categories will be taken to authoritatively disclose the nature of a human reality. And all I have to do as a psychiatrist making a clinical judgment, or whoever, I'm a clinical psychologist, like making a determination that someone's suffering delusion, is psychotic, is in a sense mad, is just see, well, are they, are the cognitive or neurological kind of tests met, and then, okay, yes, there we go. I don't have to kind of really think, I just have to, pattern match or something like that, let's see, oh, yes, is the not intrinsically psychiatric category of a certain kind of cognitive error, for example, of judgment or neurological disturbance or what have you, is that happening? Realism accountability shifts in that way. And idealism is paternalistic. Right? And relativism, I said, has this faux humility about it, the rational but in a different way idea. And by the way, relativism also trashes the insanity defense. He wasn't out of his mind, he wasn't paranoid, right? He was just differently minded. That's not going to cut it in a court. That's not going to allow somebody, cut them some slack, right? If they've done something really terrible and you wanted to be able to say, well, they were out of their mind. No, they've just got a different mind. Well, okay, then he's guilty, right? Okay. And to lose that, to lose the insanity defense, along with losing those other exculpations we make for the sometime insane members of our families and lives, that's a kind of humanitarian disaster. No, you psychiatrist, in your psychiatric judgment, you have to be where the buck stops. And your task is to step up with, I'm going to use a lovely kind of Greek New Testament word, parousia. Your task is to step up with humble boldness and the ambition of speaking truth. Is to become yourself a living embodiment of psychiatric wisdom, is to become humbly authoritative, and to refine that unendingly for the rest of your clinical lives. Thanks.
Hiya. Thank you for the talk. I thought that was fantastic. I wonder whether, is there a danger that we end up labeling people mad as a result of a failure of our own interpretation? And in some sense, when we fail at interpreting the putatively mad person, there's a risk of jumping to the idea that there is something wrong with the logic that that person is using. when in fact we should be, it may be that our interpretation itself is at fault, and it's not that they've got some funky kind of rules of identification going on. Rather, we're not identifying the object of their delusion adequately.
So it surely is the case that people can be wrong in their determination that somebody else is suffering a delusion, right? And famously, if somebody has already been, this is where epistemic injustice comes into it, if someone's already been kind of correctly judged delusional, then when they turn, then they claim to be, say, a famous author or something, the psychiatrist will write that down in their, notes too, and not realize that, the person is a famous, or it just seems unlikely to them. So that's surely a possibility. But then you rather surprised me then that you went for quite the Capgras, I think it was the misidentification delusion as a kind of possible example of that. The Capgras delusion, somebody says, of their wife with whom they've lived, all their married life, let's say, this woman is not my wife. And they can be tempted, the cognitive psychologist might try and make some sense of this, where some identification mechanisms going on, some sense of familiarity has been lost. So you can give a psychological understanding, not a rational understanding, not retrieving rationality, not necessarily retrieving rationality of it thereby. There is a way, actually, we do retrieve rationality when we say that somebody has hallucinated, right? Something like that, so that they've misunderstood what they were seeing, but they tried to make a rational judgment. So Brendan Maher, a famous psychologist, proposed this as a way to try and make sense of various delusions. People were reaching the wrong kind of jumping conclusions based on the things that they saw. They were taking them too seriously or something like that, not questioning them. But what we find in psychosis is that, one of the most rational things you might think if you were finding yourself feeling that your wife was, unfamiliar or something is, well, maybe I've got Capgras delusion, or maybe something's gone a bit wrong with my brain, what are the options here, right? This person who looks exactly like my wife, I've lost some sense of familiarity or what have you. Okay, well, these things happen. My doctors told me this, things can happen in the brain which cause this, right? But that's not what the person's, they're not playing, they're not in that kind of game, right? So it seems to me quite hard to try and hold on to the idea that they're nevertheless being rational. And of course, if we just say, well, yeah, but they're being rational in their own way, relativizing rationality to someone in his own way, well then, okay, well, 1 + 2 = 4 in its own way, and, where are we going to stop with that? There must be some accountability to any notion of rationality. So maybe the person is meaning something a bit different. When he says, my wife is not my wife, he's using language in a new way, or something like this. Right? This is kind of rather akin to what I said was the relativistic option, right? So he's got his own. What is it that stops him? This kind of thing happens sometimes. We use words in different ways. We use language in different ways. But I didn't really mean in old school speak, which most people speak, that this woman is not actually my wife, except that I married her, but she feels different, feels off, or something like that. Then you can get back together again, right? I don't mean he and his wife can get back together. You can come back together and become in the same community. You can iron out misunderstandings, but he's not responsive to that kind of move, and I think it's that lack of responsivity which warrants saying that he is no longer making a kind of sense. And I think the hypothesis that there's some kind of sense which outstrips our capacity to any capacity to kind of reason him out of it, or whatever, is overreach, is not itself kind of playing the accountability game when it comes to making hypotheses, in fact.
I was interested in what you said about the dream. You talked about the way we dream, all of us, and we kind of merge things together. And you gave the example of swimming pools and some other things, I think. I was left with a feeling of hope about that, and I don't know whether that's kind of naive, but were you in a certain kind of way saying that within all of us there is this capacity to merge things, to make similarities out of things which in our waking hours wouldn't make sense, would be classed as kind of madness. And that there is a chance, therefore, if we can use that and just allow ourselves to be a bit like our dream state, that we could actually communicate in a better way with people who've got thought disorder or schizophrenia or whatever.
I mean, whether it makes for communicating in a better way, I don't know, but it's surely, yes, it's important. The idea of psychosis as waking dream, I mean, it's a paradoxical idea, the idea of a waking dream in a sense, right? But the idea, we kind of understand where it's coming from. It's a really venerable old one. It's Kant had the idea, Schopenhauer had the idea, you find it in Jung, you find it all the major psychologists. We notice that the character of thought, the condensations especially, that, you know, to use the Freudian term, is very similar. And if we can just notice of ourselves that we are all psychotic in our sleep, in that way, maybe that can help, you know, find some common ground, some similarity. Whether or not people who are waking dreamers can really communicate, because in a sense when you're in a dream you are in a world of one, and what that means to be in your own world is another kind of talk basically, but it can intuitively vibe with that you're not responsive to the same kind of interpersonal calibration, correction, reason responsiveness and so on. Whether or not you can communicate, I don't know. I mean, if you're doing psychotherapy with someone who's psychotic, right, if you just try and refute the delusions, you're probably going to be onto a bit of a, you know, it's not going to get you very far. Partly because someone might need to have those delusions, and to deprive them of them could be cruel, right? But if you build enough resources of the ego capacity to tolerate difficult feelings and so on, help with the work and the supportive therapeutic relationship, help do that, then I think one thing you can do at a certain point in the work is to explore with somebody the idea of the symbolic meaning of their delusions. And that's very similar, it seems to me, from the way in which dreams can have what we call a symbolic kind of sense. In a dream or in a myth, in children's play, difficult emotional predicament can get represented by figures which are not the figures which maybe most kind of caused it or so on. And there's thought of a slip-slidey sort which serves the expression of an unmanageable, unmetabolized emotional predicament of some sort. And so helping somebody, if you're a clinician who's attuned to the psychotic wavelength, who's able to understand the dreaminess of psychotic thought, the way in which it slips and slides around and is driven by motivational and emotional dynamism of its own, which is akin to that which forms dreams. And I think you're onto then some kind of therapeutic communication can get going. It's not about rational retrievability, but it is about a kind of a communication. Yeah.
Going sideways, and perhaps just picking up on what you've alluded to just now, and I'm no philosopher, is this, your analysis, not emphasizing rather too much the logical, rational links and leaving out affect? And as a clinician, practicing, part of my assessment was always that the affect is either sort of loosened, not attached to the cognitions, or flat, or not always, but sometimes. So, for instance, let's do a sort of extreme example. Let's posit, the world is overpopulated, the Malthusian idea. Okay, well, therefore, we need to reduce the number of people in the world. Therefore, let's have genocide. That will solve the problem. That's a logical sequence of thought, but you get, in certain logical arguments, and I apologize for the crudity of that one, if you follow a logical argument, you get to a point along the line where you think the logic's fine, but I'm not going there. And that's when you need your feeling affect state. And what I'm suggesting, or what I think, or what I'm asking you is, is not the lack of affect attached to the thinking or the cognition one of the areas where there's a sort of purchase on the understanding of the state?
Would you mind me asking, would you be comfortable diagnosing someone as psychotic on the basis not of there being unreasonable what they're saying or lacking reason, but simply on the basis of lacking emotional response at a certain point? I mean, it's certainly, we often see it, and it could be a real, what psychiatrists might call an index of psychosis. It might be a strong indicator, it might go along with it very, I mean, but whether or not, and also, when I'm talking about rationality, I'm not necessarily talking about reasoning or talking about steps. This is the thought from Chesterton, but many psychiatrists have kind of, Jaspers mentions this too, that the person with very intact reasoning capacities often makes the most elaborate delusions. Something's gone wrong in the reality contact of the premises, not in the kind of the getting from premises to conclusions. But reason is more than kind of reasoning. Our contact with reality, as you say, I believe our contact with reality is not kind of mediated by emotion as if it was a stepping stone, but it is an emotional contact with reality. That's where we are grounded, and emotion and right reason are one and the same. And it's when somebody sometimes is, say, chillingly switched off just when you might think that love was on the scene or something like that, that we can sense that something very disturbed has happened. Disturbed in their reality contact itself, yes. So from a clinical point of view, 100% right. But in the talk, I'm really just trying to take a pop. I'm trying to take a stand against these kind of relativist or people who do try and use a reasoning-based approach and say, well, there could be different forms of reasoning. So it's a kind of critical, clinically, yes, affect, very important. From a point of view of the dialectic of the talk, wasn't quite so important today, but yeah.
Michel Foucault has written a book, La folie et la déraison, the history of madness, and he has charted different ways, cultural ways and assumptions which have underlined the way in which our society or societies have dealt with the so-called insane. And he compared the way in which the so-called insane were dealt with in the ancient world, were regarded as in a way better or different, a higher reason. And later on, I mean, he speaks of a ship of fools in the Middle Ages, but also in some societies, for example, in some Islamic societies, the fool is actually a channel of divine truth. So Foucault links all this to the way in which we've chosen to deal with the so-called insane by shutting them in asylums. And dealing with them in extremely authoritarian ways. I mean, Jeremy Bentham, the high priest of utilitarianism, the panopticon, I know that applies mostly more to the jail, the idea that you're always inspecting, observing, and keeping under control, controlling those who are different. I mean, anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very popular romantic idea about madness, that it is its own kind of, is a deeper insight, a deeper truth. Like I said, the doors of perception are blasted open, the shaman and the schizophrenic, like it's just that we stigmatize certain people and who don't have roles now of important roles and so on, who could actually kind of really contribute something and so on. I think that there is a little bit of truth in it, right? But I think that on the whole, it's not a good thought. Firstly, I think it is a romanticization. If you've been to, I don't know, many Islamic societies that, you know, you mentioned Islamic justice there. I don't think it is the case that people are treated with a kind of often found a valuable role in the community, or are kind of helped to that their hallucination, what we might call hallucinations, are instead kind of understood as, you know, I don't know, spirit visions or something like that. It can be often people have been treated very cruelly by all sorts of societies, chained up outside the village or in the pigsty or something like that. You know, I say all of that, and then again, I have met and worked with, and when I say worked with, I don't mean as a psychologist, I mean actually when I was doing kind of building work when I was kind of younger, with people who have what we might call a schizotaxic disposition. They have some kind of looseness of associations of thought and a sensitivity to aspects of other people's psychology, which they don't formulate in a typical way, and may take on rather kind of colourful or esoteric, use kind of colourful or esoteric language to describe it. They may have a role in amongst some people as a kind of a lay healer or something like that. And through recovering social status through those roles, manage not to kind of feel terribly outcast. Tanya Luhrmann has got a wonderful kind of book on this, actually, the American anthropologist who writes quite a bit about psychiatric matters. She looks at why, I don't know if it's actually what the latest data on this is, but it seems that people in the first world and in urban areas often recover rather less well than people in countries where they may not be socially excluded for being psychotic and so on. But I would say that some of those people I met who had a rather unusual way of thinking, and whose unusual way of thinking occasionally resulted in a hospitalization or something like that, were able at other times, through kind of finding a certain niche in the social world, of being seen as a bit of a kind of mystic or healer or something like that, to do something rather kind of good and useful. But it's also the case that societies who do have shamans do make distinctions between the shaman and the psychotic, right, for example. And I think it is really easy to kind of, romanticize the psychotic condition and just say, do you remember earlier I said, I think it's important sometimes to do a bit of philosophy and not simply come up with, wonderful sounding ideas, but to put them to challenge them, to test them. What does it actually mean to say this? Their own kind of reason, their own kind of insight. Is it insight? What would make it count as insight, right? What would make it count as doors of perception actually opened, right? You just say these things. So that's some kind of response.
The question is, what if the detachment from reality, the periodic detachment from reality, is actually a very rational response to the environment, to the situation? There are many situations of people who are exceptionally rational, and then they may have these episodes, for example. So maybe the problem is not that something wrong with them, but what it's outside them. And it would be a very big mistake if we were to classify them as there's something wrong with you.
There's two thoughts I'm having. Let's say you are in a toxic environment of some sort, psychologically toxic environment, right? Two things you might think. One is it makes rational sense to get out of there, right? So, but I don't think that's quite what you were saying. I mean, it's not, if you've got a terrible job, it makes rational sense to quit the job if you can, right? Okay, so I think that's right. But that's not what we mean by losing touch of reality, right? So, but instead you might think, well, another thing is that if being in touch with that, staying in that terrible job, which exceeds your ability, with that horrible boss who's just gaslighting you all the time, or whatever, is emotionally intolerable. You might not be able to have the kind of wit to think, or the financial possibility of thinking, let's get out of there. It might overwhelm, though, your ability to emotionally overwhelm your ability to cope. And in that sense, does it make sense to think, well, the rational thing to do then is to go to take leave of your senses, because then you're kind of leaving behind psychologically the intolerable predicament, and you've substituted it for a more tolerable kind of alternative delusional world. So it's, as I said, do you remember earlier in the talk where I distinguished between this, the motivationally intelligible, psychological understanding and rational understanding? So surely in these cases, we can see exactly why somebody could be motivated to, and why it could be very relieving to take leave of, in one sense, take leave of rational reality contact and live in an alternative reality in which they are the hospital porter who's lost his wife and whatever it is instead the King of France. And yeah, it's not that that's a rational thing to do, but it's certainly psychologically intelligible, and you can hopefully we can sympathize with it, and it makes sense. There's a sense in which it makes sense. Here's the thing, though: things make sense in different ways, right? They can make causal sense of how the ancestry of something. You can make rational sense of whether or not it's rationally intelligible. You can make psychological sense of it, of whether it's motivated and might be relieving. And those things, they're disjunctive, right? So you can have in fact, often they're antithetical. So you can have psychological intelligibility without rational intelligibility. Yeah. The point is that just because something's psychologically intelligible doesn't mean that it's not mad, right? Precisely, we understand psychologically why somebody had to go mad. That's the kind of the thought I was, should have just finished what I was saying.
Thank you. I was just wanting to clarify something. When you're saying that the relativistic view is kind of like an attempt at humility, but it is actually narcissistic, is this because there's always kind of a hidden assumption that our schema is the correct one, or just that we can't actually step outside of our schema, so we end up pulling them into ours anyway? I just wanted to clarify what you meant.
I mean, ultimately, what we'd arrived at, if we push the philosophical argument through, I think is a critique of the very idea of our schema, or the idea of different schemas, different worlds of rational thought. I think that's the thing which would have to collapse in the end. That's part, I think, of the faux humility, is this idea, well, it's just within my schema, this is how I see things. But it's not even, Donald Davidson's got his nice paper somewhere, if I remember rightly, from about 30 years ago, on the critique of the very idea of a conceptual scheme, in which he kind of pushes this idea forwards further. The lack of humility is in thinking that these thoughts about our schema and your schema and so on even make sense. I think that's the fun, and one just kind of helps oneself to this fine-sounding kind of philosophical ideas without really interrogating them properly.
Hi, thank you for your talks. I was just wondering if we grant that there's sort of no rationality in the mad person's viewpoint, and that there's sort of one kind of rationality and one schema that makes sense. I wanted to ask about the idea of warrant, and basically what is it that says that we should be rational and that we are thereby warranted in sort of intervening when someone thinks they're being rational but they're not, instead of just saying you're not being rational?
Psychiatrically, the warrant shouldn't simply be, I think, that somebody is just, because you're irrational, I'm going to stuff you full of drugs, or, whatever, to send you to therapy or something. It's like, is it a problem for you, or sometimes is it a problem for, other people, a serious problem for other people, and so on. But you'd only warrant a psychiatric approach in those contexts if you did have the kind of lack of rationality. Otherwise, it'd be a criminal approach or something else. But can you? I'm just getting a bit tired. If I haven't yet answered enough, say the question a bit more, especially the bit I didn't answer.
I was thinking sort of, sometimes we might think, according to our sort of rationality, that someone is impaired in different ways. Certain sort of capabilities that we think that they should have, and they don't, and they're not displaying. And we also might take that person to be irrational in certain ways, so they might have delusions. But what about when that person doesn't take themselves to be sort of impaired or distressed, but we think that they sort of almost should be by their condition? And whether we're sort of warranted in making that judgment, sort of stretching from their irrationality in some contexts to whether or not we should override their own sort of well-being assessment, if that makes sense.
I guess, I mean, first of all, yeah, like just to stress the idea, it's really important that people are only, you know, so when someone's in her madness, then she's in her madness. When she's not, she's not. Let's not get too excited about being rational all the time and all of that, you know, whatever. You know, people who are very rational all the time can be very boring and, you know, all the rest of it. So you know, I'm not trying to stand up here as some kind of high priest of rationality. But there's a tempting pragmatic way that British psychiatrists will often do, which is, well, is it just, you know, is it causing a problem? Otherwise, leave well alone. I kind of worry about that a bit. I think I'm sure it's fine. It's right. It's just kind of, you know, quick kind of solution. Just, is it a problem for that person? Do they want help? Are they actually seeking help? Most of the time, would they wish that in those times when they go mad, that then they would have, you know, some help, even if at those times they weren't going to seek it? You know, could they make a kind of advance directive, as it were, for themselves? And, you know, those are all considerations just to be thrashed out, aren't they, between the patient and the clinician and his family, and also socially and so on. I don't know if they're very philosophical questions per se. I do wonder about one thing that the pragmatic psychiatrist often leaves out, it seems to me, is the consideration of dignity. So you get these rather hedonic, whatever, kind of conceptions of well-being. Is someone, if someone's happy, then just leave them alone, kind of thing. Well, does happiness really consist simply in feeling good about yourself? Or is a happy life one which has actually got some dignity to it, which might involve being in touch with reality to some degree? I mean, we might find it in ourselves. We might, you know, without kind of wanting to just impose, you know, kind of desiderata of sanity on everyone. We might, I don't know, what do you think? But I think that it's important to me, and admittedly I'm some Oxford philosophy type kind of geezer, right? But I don't think I'm that unusual in thinking that, yeah, it's kind of, there's something, I don't want to be mad. You know, it's not something that I kind of would be that happy with. I think it's partly because it impairs something that I consider fundamental to my dignity, which is kind of trying to be in touch with and do just some kind of justice to respond appropriately, emotionally, rationally, all the rest of it, to the world around me and to others around me. So maybe considerations of dignity, as well as, oh, he's perfectly happy, let him carry on just kind of walking naked down the hospital or something. I mean, really?
So, from what I understand of it, you lay down like a realist, a relativist, and an idealist position. We have rejected the relativistic position, and we're not exactly sure now where we're standing in terms of relativism, of idealism and realism. And now my question, with that in mind, is, in relativism, essentially we have a criterion that is self-referential. I myself am a self-referential criterion, in this case of rationality and non-madness. I say that, according to how I think, I am sane, and therefore I am sane. I am the criterion of my own rationality. Whereas, in idealism, we have other minds that are doing that. So based on what other minds, and then we have like a democracy of sanity. So 5 minds say that I'm sane, 10 say that I'm insane. Therefore, in a criterion of democratic rationality or something, I'm decreed insane. But then there's also an element of that being able to accept as a judgment. And then there's the realist option, where it says, regardless of other minds out there in the world, there's like this type of pattern or this type of brain or this type of thinking and behavior, whichever way we want to describe it, is deemed as, we've seen that there is a correlation and then a little bit of convention, someone is mad by definition, right? Now, that is part of the question. And then the second comes in, assuming that we take an idealist position, which I think we have to take to some extent, there needs to be some sort of agreement between minds, between what is sane and what is insane. What happens on the cases where we have insane societies? and that's the societies that we criticize, or insane groups. So, for example, we have philosophers, like, right? They're doing a sort of critique on the society, and they say, oh, wait a moment, actually what you're doing right now is not exactly sane. That's why, for example, Plato would say, if you want the best ruler for your city, you need a philosopher, because a philosopher is someone who can think about the society and about things in general, and then make a sound judgment. But what is it that makes the judgment of those people sane and us insane?
So, I mean, as you've heard from the talk, I rejected all of idealism, realism, and relativism, right? And I define them in a particular kind of ways. I define them all as attempts to answer a certain question, right? The question being, what gives, what kind of general criterion could we appeal to justify why it's right to say of somebody that they are out of touch with reality, mad in some way. One criterion was, I mean, I don't give the whole talk again, but like one criterion is like, well, it just doesn't hang together with the rest of everyone, The other one was there's something up with his brain. That's the criterion, not simply the cause, but the criterion, or whatever. And then the third one was a kind of like, well, in a way, nothing really gives. It's just people live in their different worlds, and we should live and let live, kind of thing. So, but what I'm doing is I'm rejecting the question, right? So it's not simply that I don't think we need one of these three. If we define realism, idealism, relativism as attempts to answer this question, I didn't go on to try and give you an answer to the question. I don't think it's a good question, any more than what gives it someone who gets the right to say this is a pen or whatever. Psychiatric judgment, it's not, we don't do well to try and justify psychiatric judgment itself. And then you might think, oh, does that just leave it completely unjustified? No, in any particular judgment you make, you can justify it, right? Why did you say he was mad? Well, he thinks the CIA is after him, but he's been working all, and he's got these, thinks there's a microchip in his left ear and so on, right? And those would be the kinds of things you'd say. You don't give a general philosophical account which reduces psychiatric judgment to some other form of judgment, whether it's numbers game in society or something in your brain or whatever, right? Anyway, that's the kind of first point. Mad societies, yeah. So, I mean, if you're attracted to the question and then thereby you're attracted to an idealist solution because it seems more reasonable than the relativist or the realist solutions, then you can see why mad societies, you've got a problem, right? So that's why I said there seems to be a problem with idealism, because it kind of doesn't seem to allow us to make sense of the idea that you could have. Actually, I didn't say this, did I? I said it in my book. I just forgot. I forgot to say in my talk, but that was a kind of critique that I would kind of share, right? So, yeah, why can't there be? You can have folie à deux, after all. Two people may share the same delusion. Someone perhaps has got the more serious problem, but the other person ends up going along with it and not realizing they're slipped into a delusional way of thinking too. Folie à, I don't know, 70 million people, or however many are in Britain. I don't know, why is that really conceptually unintelligible? I'm not sure. It seems to me possible that under some intolerable emotional strain, utterly intolerable emotional strain, a whole group of people could go psychotic. And I don't mean that, delusional. I don't just mean that in some metaphorical sense, that they might start believing terrible things or whatever, but they'd actually become psychotic. I don't see why that shouldn't be the case.
So I had a couple of thoughts. One on it's a clinical judgment. So I started off, I think, thinking about delusion as I think you started with. So that it's going to be a necessary part of the clinical judgment as to whether someone's got a delusion, as to whether their belief is in fact false. So if we say of someone, oh, he's paranoid because he thinks his mum did this, that, and the other, stole his social security benefits, it may in fact be true that mum stole social security benefits. I mean, somebody other than the clinician, a social worker or somebody, is going to need to investigate. So it's a necessary part of the clinical judgment. The clinical judgment is going to depend on factual judgments, which the clinician is not best placed to make. maybe I don't know. I don't think that's inconsistent with what you said, but some forms of psychosis perhaps are. It's not that they're delusional. You know, the terrible thing did happen to me. It's just that now my entire psychological economy is focused on that terrible thing. So I have true beliefs about whatever it was. I'm not delusional, but my mental economy's collapsed because that's all that reality is for me now. Sorry, those were two thoughts that your lovely paper caused me to have. So anyway.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, on the first one, I mean, falsity. Jaspers talks about delusions being kind of like pathologically falsified beliefs. And then that question is, does that mean that they are, as it were, false in the ordinary sense of false, like not true, and then there's some extra swanky stuff going on and make it pathological? So it's been recognized in psychiatry for some time that you can have true, in one sense, true delusions. So, for example, well, it's a bit like these Gettier examples. Do you remember earlier I was talking about the kind of, people who want to get to knowledge from belief by adding stuff, and then Gettier comes along and said, well, even justified true belief, doesn't count as knowledge in certain kind of quirky circumstances. So true with delusion. You're on a, you're on a, sorry, this is a very nerdy kind of philosophical response, but like, you're on a desert island and you've got the delusion that World War II has broken out. Unbeknownst to you, actually it has broken out, you just, right? So you can, or actually in Oxford, someone was diagnosed with the delusion that they were mentally ill some time ago. And that's a paradoxical one, right? Because it's true, that was, and because they had warranted a diagnosis, but the whole way of thinking about it, the whole kind of basis of their thought was up the creek. You can also get people who have, a bit like the World War case, someone who thinks that their husband's having an affair, or some kind of erotomanic delusion, or some delusion of jealousy. It might not have been true at the beginning, but by the end of living with someone who's got that kind of preoccupation for a while, you might well be having an affair which you keep secret, but the other half kind of claims that you. So I think that kind of falsity needn't kind of be a criterion of delusionality. As for loss of reality contact is the relevant thing, which, as I said at the beginning, I didn't kind of flesh this out in a talk, but it has to do not so much with whether or not you've tested whether or not your belief qua hypothesis is actually kind of correct or not, but whether or not your thought has collapsed in a certain kind of way, such that it's no longer possible for somebody to meaningfully say of you either that you are engaging in an act of imagination right now, or in an act of reality-oriented judgment, but that those two kind of modes of thought, which normally is a kind of Hegelian thought, they negate each other, they constitute each other through their differentiation. They've actually kind of, the person no longer exhibits consistently kind of hanging together different sets of criteria for engaging in an imaginative episode or engaging in an episode of reality-oriented cognition. And so there's this fused state. But that, I think, is what the kind of the best way to understand the nature of delusion. I've spoken of the overvalued idea, because there's this kind of commonality of the overvalued kind of idea that you talked about later on with the delusion. Both of them can be very pervasive, a kind of a fixed, an enclosed system of thought, which can be very preoccupying and give a lot of structure and order to someone's mind and world, especially if they're falling apart. I guess what makes the difference between delusion and overvalued idea is just has to do with the extent to which they are able to begin to think about this thing alongside someone else, or to the extent in which reality testing is to some degree preserved.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. We need to draw things to a close there. Thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. Let's thank Richard once again.